Welcome back, everybody. This is Dan Libenson, and I am here with Denise Handlarski, and we are here for another episode of Daring Judaism. Denise, it's really great to see you.
Yes, good to see you too. It feels like 50 years since last week when I spoke with you. I can't believe how long this week has been. And I kind of like that we do this on Fridays. It really rounds out the week in a nice way.
Yeah, it's funny. Like I can't tell if it feels like 50 years or yesterday. Like time is something so different these days.
Yes, it is.
Like my wife and I have been saying that our experience is basically that Monday is like a really long day, and then it's Friday. There's something about that. And then also, but like you say, when you look back and you think about what were we talking about last week, and it seems that it was so long ago. I think that what I wanted to start with this week, I mean, even though so much of what we're talking about in terms of what's been happening in the U.S. and Canada, also with regard to the racial divisions, but I would say even I don't know, like something has broken. I don't know if to say broken through, because honestly, I'm very skeptical about what's going to end up happening, because I just skeptical about the capacity of institutions to repair themselves after a long period of time. And I'm as we've talked about, I'm a little bit excited about the possibility of some kind of break, a different kind of break that causes a reimagining. So breaking through is not quite the right word, like breaking open. I mean, there seems to be something that's happened. I actually was really interested to see the New York Times bestseller list. I don't know if you saw this, that
I did
top
see
10 books are all related to
all race.
Race. Yeah. And and I think they're all like in a progressive direction, right? You could imagine a lot of times the things that end up on the New York Times bestseller list include, various meditations on race from some, right-wing perspective that it doesn't seem to be the case. So
no, these ones are good.
That
is heartening that at least people are learning about this issue in a new way.
Yeah. I mean, except that, also not to always be the downer, but I don't think people are reading that much these days. So I think it actually takes not that many book sales to take out on the New York Times bestseller list.
I think people are reading. I don't have time for anything, but I've been reading more because I just can't look at screen. I just, you know what I mean? I'm on screen so much for work that I want to do something that's not a screen after work. So I've been reading more, in fact.
Yeah. Well, so we're going to come back to that, because this week's Torah portion definitely has I wouldn't say the first incident of racism in the Torah, but the first one that we've encountered, I think, since we started this show. So, which is an interesting dimension of starting the show in Leviticus. Actually, I think, it's an interesting thing to consider. Maybe we should, I don't know. But anyway, there is an incident that we should discuss. But I wanted to pick up on last week's Torah portion a little bit first, and not focus on the Torah portion part, but focus on our Daring Judaism theme. And it specifically involved last week's Torah portion, including what's called the priestly blessing, which was a blessing that the priests traditionally gave to the people. It is a blessing that, at least in Orthodox synagogues, the priests, the people who are from the priestly caste, I guess, people that are Kohens, they often will go up to the front of the room during services at a certain point and cover their heads with the talit, the prayer shawl, and say this blessing for the people. That's done less in progressive synagogues of all kinds. Even conservative synagogues, I don't think, generally do that. And it's also a blessing that I think, to the extent that people are familiar with it, and I'm not sure if this is kind of what it's always been the tradition, but it seems like many people, when they bless their children, and they say the traditional blessing of the children, which is may God make you like, and for boys, it's the sons of Joseph, Ephraim, and Manasseh, and for girls, it's the matriarchs, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah, and then often is followed by these blessings. May God bless and keep you. May God shine his face upon you and grant you peace. I think I'm mixing up the second two. I always do. And may God, basically may God, the problem is that I'm translating them on the fly, as opposed to knowing that I actually know them.
You're doing very well.
No, but it's But anyway, I think Grant You Peace is the third one. So whatever. But the point is that there are these very beautiful blessings, but they're really about, may God do this thing. And I think that the thing that really struck me when I read those in the Torah portion, and I also think that my children, even though we don't do a lot of traditional things, in fact, we don't actually traditionally bless our children, but when we're over at a friend's house then they do, we always do. And our children love it, and I always feel guilty every time that we don't generally do that. And the kids really, really love it. And so maybe we should. And then, my question is kind of, there's something about the priestly blessing in particular. I think that there are various archaeological finds have found that it's actually an extremely ancient. It's one of the most ancient parts of the Torah. It would appear that this blessing long pre-existed the writing of the Torah, that this was some traditional blessing. And so there's something about it that feels like very ancient, and therefore it's attractive to me to say these ancient words that our ancestors were saying for so long, even though I don't actually believe nor really care about the content, but I'm actually attracted to the idea of this chain of saying the same thing. And I know that a lot of people feel that way. And yeah, if we're talking about the entire service for 3 hours, I would say let's move beyond that. But the question, I guess, is kind of, how do you feel about that for like a short prayer?
Well, I mean, this is where often, sorry, I thought this was plugged in and it's not. I'm just dealing with the tech. I don't want everything to dial. So, I mean, this is often a question that comes up in, my movement of secular humanistic Judaism. This is really one of the things that sets us apart, because other movements also recognize there are at least a number of people who don't believe in God or don't believe the language of the prayers that they're saying, but they really believe that the keeping that tradition of saying those same words itself does have value. And so for them, it is worth it to say those same words, and including the full prayer service of many hours. So, and then in our movement, as I said, we tend to come down on the other side of that and say words have meaning and power. And how can you, at the moments that you're trying to foster your, highest self or your most spiritual self, if you're saying words you don't believe in, then you're sort of both cheapening your own experience and also cheapening those very words for the people who do believe them. And so that's my take on it. I don't say those words, although I can appreciate why some might. I don't think either one is right or wrong. It's just that a different approach will work better for other people. I don't want to, bless my children in the name of a God I don't believe in. For the blessing of the children, use Marcia Fox's blessing, which is from her book, The Book of Blessings. And it simply says, may you be who you are, and may you be all that you are. And I really love that blessing on children. And so I say it to my kids every Friday when we have Shabbat dinner. And I like that we've kept the tradition of blessing the children. That is a very, longstanding tradition, but that we can make it meaningful for us. So as I said, no one's right or wrong, but I do think that it's a really important difference philosophically in how we want to do our Judaism.
Right. How does the secular humanistic movement handle the mourner's Kaddish? Like, what is it? Is it not said? Is there something that's an alternative?
Yeah, there's an alternative. And in fact, there isn't one alternative, because that's the thing. When everybody starts to change it, you're going to get a lot of variations, but I think that's okay. So some of them try to start the same way. A lot of them start nit gadal, v'nit kadesh, like we are sanctifying, we are blessing, as opposed to something from on high. Some of them are just in English. There's variation, as I said, but again, it retains the tradition of saying something at a burial or at a shiva, but with words that people can believe in. Because I personally have officiated funerals, and people who maybe don't have a strong Jewish education tell me they want to recite Kaddish. So what I do as a rabbi, and I think most of the rabbis in the humanistic Jewish movement do this, I say, like, I'm not going to say those words because I don't believe them, but if you want to, or somebody in the family wants to, that's fine. Mm-hmm. But then they look at it and they're like, oh, I don't want to say this. I don't believe this at all. And why is it like praising God at this moment that I'm really sad? So it leads to interesting conversation. So I just really am a believer in having more choices. So I present, clients when I'm doing their funeral with the option of what's the tradition and what's a secular take and what feels good for you. We could do both. We could do neither and just read a poem. Different things work for different people.
Yeah. I mean, I when I think about the Mourner's Kaddish, I think about that really nobody knows what it means unless they look up the translation, because first of all, it's not in Hebrew, it's in Aramaic. And
Right.
if you look at the translation, then you do see that it actually has nothing to do with a dead person. It has to do with basically
Nothing.
praising God. But I think about it as kind of a magical incantation more than a thing that should be translated, right? Meaning that, like, when you do, meditation in Buddhism or whatever, and you say, or is it Hindu meditation? I don't know. When you say Om, I don't know what that means, and I'm sure that I've known what it means at different points, and it just goes in and out of my head, and there are all kinds of things that I could imagine that you say in Buddhism, in sort of American Buddhism, that are in various languages and nobody really knows what they mean. It doesn't really matter. They're being used as a incantation, as a kind of whatever that's called, when you meditate. The question is, like, is there some value to, like, I think that the Mourner's Kaddish really, in most people's experience, it's not about the words at all. It's about the quote melody, and the melody is not really a melody. It's a kind of a spoken word, right? And so I wonder if you were going to present an alternative, then it would feel to me, for example, like it really has to fit the meter. And if it fit the meter, right? So nit gadal v'nit gadash, right? Like that makes sense, because that's very close. I mean, that's the same words, but instead of saying that it's about God, it's about us, so that, and so that actually feels like strong to me as an idea, because nobody actually really cares what the words, I mean, not nobody, but a lot of people don't really care what the words are. They care what the sound is like. And actually it reminds me of somebody, I think it was Dan Horowitz, said a while ago when we had him on Judaism Unbound. He's a rabbi and was in Detroit. Now he's just moved to Florida, but he talked about that actually a lot of cantors think it's really cool to change the music, change the tune to some prayer like Adon Olam. And the fact is that most people only know the prayers based on a certain tune. Like they actually don't understand the words. They only know even how to say the words because they're used to saying them with this tune. And so if you change the tune, you think you're making it more accessible, because now it's like Take Me Out to the Ball Game or whatever, some tune that they know, but now they don't know the words anymore because they only knew the words when they were attached to that tune. So in a certain way, it's kind of alienating. And, people don't think of it that way. And so it's interesting to think about, especially something like the Mourner's Kaddish, or maybe even the priestly blessing, the blessing of the children, that it has a little bit of a tune to it. And that's actually what people are attracted to. But I also feel like I do struggle with this question about the value or the lack of value in this kind of ancient pedigree, because I think about, for me, there's actually two dimensions. One is like my own nostalgia. And that is a one generation thing, right? Because if you change that practice, then the next generation doesn't have that nostalgia. So if it was only about nostalgia, then I would say we should change it, because that's just, we shouldn't hold back the evolution of Judaism just because we have it, we don't like it so much. That's the whole point about an immigrant who, you move to a new country and it's kind of tough on the parents who immigrated, but they know that they're building a life for their kids and they're going to be completely used to it. And so you bite the bullet and you do it. So I think that there is a piece that's nostalgia. The other piece, though, that feels important is some degree of a connection to the past. And I say that very sparingly, meaning like you could say that about literally every part of Judaism. And I'm the last person to say we should retain the vast majority of Judaism. I just wonder whether there's something to be said for, in the case of the priestly blessing, something extremely ancient. And in the case of the Kaddish, something that fundamentally doesn't actually have any literal meaning at all. The meaning in the minds of people, it doesn't actually mean anything. And so we're now trying to take it away from them because we say it does mean something. And, but then they don't have the ability to have this, sort of, kind of like, and again, we might go back that the only reason they won it is because of nostalgia, but it may also be that the tune, so to speak, of the Mourner's Cottage has some power. Like maybe it actually is like the ba-dum of it is kind of like moving to people.
Yeah, I mean, that's one element. The other part I would add is that people know when to say amen. There's like a bit of a call and response nature. So everybody feels like they're part of a team. And I mean, the challenge I have with what you're saying, and again, I mean, if it works for people, that's fine. No judgment. But here's why it doesn't work for me. Because I think you can make the same argument with any prayer. I know you're saying these ones are old and special, but honestly, the people do make this argument over prayer. And I've heard Reform rabbis say it's the worst when people actually look up the translation, because then they stop wanting to say it. It was better when they just thought it was a bunch of sounds. And I know what sound to make when, and now I feel part of this team. So I'm always going to come down on, look, different people have different character strengths and values. And when I was with Rabbis Without Borders to take a character strength test, my number one, not surprisingly, is integrity and truth telling. That's very important. I was going to say
integrity. Yeah.
Very important to me. And so for me, I can't sit there and say words I don't believe in because it's making me part of the team, and because it's nostalgic, and because it's traditional, and because I don't care what they mean, the sound works for me. That's not who I am. I know it works for others. I know there's plenty of people sitting in prayer services who couldn't care less what those words mean, and that's okay. But that's why we just need different pathways. Because when I read the Marsha Falk Blessing on Children, I was like, oh, good. Like, I love the idea of the tradition of blessing my children, but I wasn't going to say it that other way. So I'm so happy to have this choice. And then I just think it keeps the tradition alive, because not yet, they're quite young, but my children will know what the tradition is and what the traditional words are. And this is why we do it this way. And so they'll have access to that treasury of knowledge, and they'll figure out how they want to do it. But I think if we don't do it the way that works for us and it lacks that integrity, like, I don't know why bother.
Yeah, I mean, I think the downside of that is like what they won't have is that sort of discovery that, wow, this thing that we say has actually been said for many thousands of years in these same words. And I don't know that necessarily that's so valuable, but I mean, that's one thing that we're making not a possibility by that choice. In terms of whether words have meaning or not, I've told the story before in Judaism Unbound, but when I was on a search committee for my synagogues, which is a conservative synagogue, that I'm a member of, but I'm not a conservative Jew. But and I'm kind of put on these kind of committees as a kind of contrarian voice, which I really appreciate. But
you must drive them bananas.
So you can imagine that I drove these rabbinical candidates bananas with these questions, and I asked, like, well, basically, could a non-Jewish parent have an aliyah, like, be called to the Torah for their child's bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah, bar mitzvah, if they're not Jewish. And the rabbi, one rabbinical candidate said, or he's a rabbi, he was a candidate for the job, said no, because the words of the blessing for when you come up to the Torah are, bless you, God, for having chosen us from all the nations. And if you're not Jewish and you haven't converted, then you're not a member of the Jewish people. So then you weren't chosen. That's not to say there's something bad about you that you weren't chosen. But the point that he was saying is that, I mean, it could be, but in this particular rabbi's view, that wasn't what he was trying to say. He was trying to say, like, it's just not correct. It's not factual, and therefore it would be what he called a bracha levatala, which is a kind of a waste of a blessing, because you're saying something that's not true. I mean, talk about integrity, right? I mean, it really, in a sense, it's
there
the other side of the same
coin. I think it's wrong.
You're saying. Yeah, I mean, it's the same side, the same, the other side of the coin. And and what was fascinating is that I kind of said, okay, I understand the explanation. I don't agree with it, but like, case closed, got it. Don't want to hire that person, but whatever. The other members of the committee who were less, had less Jewish education, were not fluent in Hebrew, said, wait a second, that's what the blessing means? This is a blessing they've been saying for, 40, 50, 60 years, right? That's what the blessing means.
Wow.
They've never looked it up, right? And the rabbi said, what did you think the blessing meant? And they said, well, I thought it meant something like, now we're going to read the Torah. Right? No, I mean, like now we're going to read the next part of the Torah, or thank God, now we're reading the next part of the Torah. Whatever they thought, it had nothing to do with, we were chosen from all the nations. And so then they're like, wait a second, so you're telling me that my friend is not going to be able to participate in his son's bar mitzvah because of the meaning of a blessing that I've been sitting here for 40 years and never really knew about. And and so I'm going to exclude another person from this thing because of the meaning of it. Now, my takeaway from that was, first of all, something that deeply is not working in conservative Judaism, right? But the other takeaway was that what does the blessing really mean? And who determines the meaning of a blessing? This is a serious point. This is where I think that my sense of integrity, which I think generally also comes up high in character strength tests and everything, probably I would imagine we should do it, but integrity is probably in my second order, or something, because I'm somehow able to make this leap a little more. But the way that I square it from an integrity standpoint is that the meaning of something is determined not by the meaning of the words necessarily, but by the meaning making that the community makes of it. And so if the community, for example, believes that this prayer actually says, now it's time to read the Torah, and in their mind, it's essentially an incantation. They don't know, it has no meaning, really. The words have no meaning for them. It's just that they know that this is the little song that you sing before the Torah, and in English they're translating it as now we're reading the Torah again. Then I wonder whether it's okay to say it, even though it means things that we don't say. I think it's. I'm not sort of advocating strongly for that one in particular. But I think that there's something to be said. I would say it more strongly about the Mourner's Kaddish, that it doesn't really mean anything. And what it means is we're sad that our loved one died. And if I'm not allowed to say that anymore, then I might have another nice poem that means I'm sad that my loved one died, but it doesn't have the same feeling of connection to this long past. And that would be, that's a legitimate trade-off. And I know you'll say, yes, it's legitimate. Everyone should make their own choices. But I'm trying to say, something a little more than that, which is it's strong. Yeah.
Well, maybe. And people do get hurt by those words. The reality is, if you're going to make that argument for that set of words, other people will say, but also this blessing before the Torah is very important to me. The Havdalah blessings are a great example. They're horrible. They say some really bad stuff. But so you could say, for traditional reasons, I'm going to say that Jews are better than Gentiles, which isn't there. But I don't think that's correct, and I do think words are very powerful. And I worry about the consequence of saying, oh, no, in this instance, the words don't mean this. I make them mean this other thing. When in fact, if you do that too much, I mean, I can think of contemporary examples where people are trying to justify why they say certain words, and it's not okay. So I personally am nervous. The other thing I would say is that what you're talking about relies in a funny way on a little bit of a lack of Jewish knowledge. Once people discover what the words mean, they may not feel that it's just a magical incantation anymore. They might actually recognize that what they're saying is not what they want those words to be saying as they say them, even if they like the rhythm and the cadence. So I also have a kind of pedagogy around this, where I don't like that in Judaism, sometimes for the sake of tradition, leaders, particularly rabbis, have tried to keep people less educated. Which is actually happening. It happens with history, and it happens with text sometimes, because it's hard to explain. And that also worries me Jewishly. So those are my concerns about your theory on this one.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think those are very in their place concerns. I mean, I think it actually helps at least raise a question that maybe we'll talk about in weeks to come. Because like I was telling you before we got on, I'm in some conversations with some people about an idea of creating something that we're calling a secular yeshiva. And, a yeshiva is a kind of a Jewish study house or study program, and the idea is really to have a digital place that you could go and study all these Jewish texts and other ideas, in an intense way, not for credit, not for a degree, but just for the love of studying. And then from my perspective, the goal being to build up a new leadership for, what I'm calling secular Judaism. But it's what I'm calling secular Judaism is different from the secular humanistic movement.
Yeah,
and what's interesting is to make a certain distinction, because at least for me, when I say secular, when I say secular in general, but when I'm thinking about a secular yeshiva, what I mean is that it's a yeshiva that has no religious agenda. So you could be an Orthodox Jew and come and study there, and nobody's going to try to convert you to not be Orthodox. And you don't have to take any of the classes that involve the, biblical criticism view of the Bible, if you don't want to. It's not that kind of program. It's not got, it's not giving out degrees. So it's not, doesn't have requirements, but so you can come and you could teach there if you're Orthodox, but if you're teaching there, you are sort of agreeing that you're not pushing any religious agenda. And therefore you would say things like, well, the traditional commentators see it this way, or traditionally religious, Orthodox Judaism is seen it this way. But you make you're very careful not to say this is the right way to interpret it, or this is the only proper way to practice Judaism based on this text, or that kind of thing. And to me, that's what I'm trying to get at, and to say that then I believe that what will come out of that is Jews who are secular, I think more in the way that we talk about, that will be learned, and and that will even find better solutions to the ones that we've been talking about. But I think that I wouldn't, the question is, right, to what extent is it important to define a word like secular in terms of alternative philosophy to religious, that, for example, we don't say words that we don't believe. Is that a critical definition? Is that something that goes beyond what I'm calling secular? Should I be calling my thing something different from secular? Because really what I'm trying to say is not religious, right?
Yeah. I think language is very slippery. So I think that's fine. I think when you say a secular yeshiva, people understand what you mean. Even in my online community, secular synagogue, what you're talking about is kind of what I mean. We're not affiliated with a movement. And I don't want people to worry about it. Like, I think we've spent so much time Jewishly talking about terms like what is conservative, what is like, oh my God. Enough. I have no patience for it, even within, to be honest, secular humanistic Judaism. I'm sorry for those in the movement watching it. I feel like it's a tremendous waste of time to argue over these terms. And I am not I understand the histories that come with those terms and that those are important. But now today, I just think just do the work, I love the idea of a secular yeshiva where people who are, hardcore secular atheists would come together with people who are religious but happy to talk about these texts in a secular way. What an opening up for everybody, because right now we're just in our little no, this is how we view it and there's no room for looking at it another way. I've done great text learning with Orthodox people. We know we disagree. We know that person's talking about God like a genuine all-knowing force in the world, and I'm talking about God like a literary character, or you know what I mean? But we can really learn from each other, and that, I think that's beautiful. And right now, partly because of the way we define terms, we're not really getting at that as much. So you have my worth nothing unofficial permission to call it a secular yeshiva. You don't have to be aligned with one particular way of doing secular.
Well, that's very important to me, so thank you. No, I mean, it is, but that wasn't what I was trying to achieve. But thank you. Well, let's start to talk about this week's Torah portion, because there's a lot in it. It's a really full one that includes, it's not one of these ones that has one major story, which are some of my favorites that are coming up in the Book of Numbers. But it's one that has a couple of little nuggets that are some of my favorites. And and favorites also includes, not
Bad
favorites,
stuff. Yeah.
like, right, favorites in the sense that they're interesting, but bad.
Right.
So where would you want to start? Anything that you're really itching to talk about?
Well, yes, I think because so for people who didn't watch last week when we did Daring Judaism, we spoke a lot about race and obviously the unrest and the problems of power. And I do think that is the backdrop to what we're talking about today as well, though we haven't named it specifically.
Right.
And I'm just going to for 2 seconds do a sidebar and then come back to the Torah portion. I think these conversations we're having in Jewish communities are very, very important. And I hope this isn't a bit of a flash in the pan. I hope these become sustained conversations. It's very important. And so I just want to say that.
Yes.
But the Torah portion this week talks about Moses marrying a Cushite woman. And that has racial implications. Not everybody agrees, but many people, I would say most people, maybe you can tell me if you disagree, read that as a Black woman. And then
I think Cush is in the Bible is a place in Africa. So a Cushite woman would probably most likely be Black.
Right. Now, I think to get away from the race stuff, I've seen people try to interpret it away, but let's assume for our purposes that we're talking about a person from Africa with Black skin. And then we get this, all the tech problems in the last couple of days.
I really think there's a universal tech meltdown happening across the world, which is interesting. I wonder if we can match that to anything in the biblical myth, that something happened, about 3 months in that was a meltdown. Golden calf, I guess.
Losing my mind. Anyway, I think I'm okay now. So sorry. So we hear that Moses is married to a Cushite woman, and then his siblings, Miriam and Aaron, are upset about it. And the text doesn't really explain why they're upset. But a lot of people read that as they're upset that he married somebody with Black skin. Not everybody interprets it that way. I'm sure we'll get into other interpretations. But let's look at that interpretation for a minute, because we are in a moment where we're talking about, within Jewish communities, certainly Black Jews, and who gets seen as being part of the community and who is not allowed to be part of the community in a genuine way, who gets welcomed and doesn't get welcomed. So what a time for this to come up in the weekly Torah cycle. And I think it's worth reckoning with a little bit. So that's where I would start.
Right. And the other thing, now I'm trying to remember if it was before or after this incident. If it was right before, then it's really kind of rich, which is that it's talking about this idea of the second Passover, which we'll talk about. But at the end of that, it says that everybody can make the Passover offering, including the ger, which in some translations says the convert, or something like that, the proselyte, whatever the translation is. But ger in the Bible does not mean convert. It means something like an immigrant or a stranger. Mm-hmm. It comes from the root of lagur, which is to reside. So it's somebody who's residing with you, but not necessarily exactly of you. And actually, and it's the rabbis later who who basically give it a new meaning of a convert, and then retroject that meaning into the Torah. But it's very clear that in the Torah's original, it does not mean somebody who has become a Jew. And so the text says there should be one law for you and for the ger. And so the point, all of this is to say that even if a Black person in your midst is not a Jew, it's the same law. All the more so if they're a Jew, right? So it kind of is so then this story comes either right before or right after that, where Moses marries let's say a Black woman. And first of all, under biblical law, she is now functionally a member of the Jewish people because it was a patriarchal society, and women, by definition, took on the identity of their husband. So within the Bible's own point of view, sexist as it might be, she's a Jew or she's a Hebrew, whatever. And but second of all, even if she wasn't, that there should be no distinctions made. It would appear, right? The only distinctions that I can think of that the Bible makes in terms of what we might call a racial background or a national background is there are some enemy groups, whether it's Amalek or Ammon or Moab, which are these societies, and the Bible says you should either kill all the Amalekites because they tried to kill us, or that you can never allow an Ammonite or a Moabite into the community. But those have nothing to do directly with race, and the Bible, and what it does clearly say in terms of anything that we might think of as race is that you should have the same law for everyone that lives in your midst. So I wonder whether this little story is there as an illustration of a violation of this principle, which is intentionally placed directly adjacent to that principle being announced, even though it's announced in a slightly different context. And this is a lesson from the Bible, I don't know, not necessarily, maybe it goes back to what we were talking about in terms of the priestly blessing in the sense, I'm not sure it's right to say it's a lesson from the Bible. It is a sign that we have a very ancient Jewish belief that one's race shouldn't matter in terms of one's how we conduct ourselves. And in fact, one of our greatest leaders, or two of our greatest leaders, there's a sexist issue that only Miriam was punished. But two of our greatest mythic leaders, Aaron and Miriam, screw up on this one, and Miriam is punished. So this is a big deal.
It's a big deal. I love it. I talk about intermarriage a lot. So I, often say, like, if it was good enough for Moses, if the siblings get punished for this, but I think that, yes to all of what you're saying. I think it is very hard to interpret anything in the story except to say that they were wrong to have been unwelcoming. Like some people say, no, they're upset because Moses shouldn't have married, anyone at this time or whatever. But really, I do think that that's the lesson here, that we welcome the stranger and we treat them equally, and race should have no bearing on that. It is worth talking about the fact that only Miriam gets punished, and she gets punished with a kind of scales on her skin situation. So it's pretty bad for a punishment. It's not like, a little slap on the wrist. And Aaron doesn't get punished meaningfully. So, people often look at this, we talk about intersectional feminism today, where we can't look at the issue of race without the issue of gender. We have to look at them both together, as well as issues of class and ability and all of the social forces. So this is a very interesting one to look at in an intersectional way, because the person with the least power and no voice here is the Cushite woman. And then Miriam gets punished. So we see the kind of gradations in power in the text. So that's worth exploring.
I think it's really worth exploring. Yeah, because actually it reminds me a little, I'm not sure exactly how to make the connection, but it reminds me a little of what B'nai Lappi and I have been discussing over the last couple of weeks on this other show that we're doing called The Oral Talmud, where we've been studying some Talmudic texts about the duty to protest when an injustice is happening. And the one that we did last week was about this idea that there's a certain rules about what your cow is allowed to do on Shabbat, basically. And they talk about this story of Rabban Elazar ben Azariah's cow. And the Talmud says, what are you talking about, Elazar ben Azariah's cow? Like, he was a very rich man. He had so many cows. And they're like, no, but this cow was actually his neighbor's cow. And the reason why it's called his cow is that the neighbor was violating Shabbat, via the cow. And Elazar ben Azariah didn't protest. And therefore, he takes on the neighbor's sin. And it's now referred to as his cow, meaning his sin, right? And so I think it's, and then the Talmud goes on much beyond that and says basically, if you don't protest, and probably the Talmud is really talking about violations of Jewish law, but it certainly can be expanded from there. And it is even in the Talmud that if you don't protest somebody else's violation, then you take on that sin. And the question, and then the text that we did yesterday had to do with the destruction of Jerusalem, which the Talmud attributes to this situation between like two people who were, kind of enemies. But the bottom line is that it ends up getting blamed mostly on these bystanders who didn't intervene. And so the destruction of Jerusalem was the result of a bystander who didn't intervene, or the result of analogous things. And so the tradition takes very seriously this idea that these kind of things are so important, and that even the bystander is punished. But what's interesting, I think, in this story is that Miriam may or may not, or it seems like Miriam was not a bystander. She was one of two, co-guilty parties, but the male is not punished. I think about the man as like, Aaron as analogous to the police officers that tend to do really bad things and are not punished. Whereas if a regular citizen would do exactly the same things, especially if they were not white, but even if they were white in cases like if they murder, that they would be punished. And so, so actually an often missed, there's sexism for sure here, but there's also missed here is what you could call Aaron's male privilege, white privilege of being in a position of power, but that for some reason Aaron is not punished for this terrible thing that Miriam is punished for. It's very troubling.
Now, it is troubling. And I don't know if this is too much applying our contemporary lens on a text that's not contemporary, but I think one reading of it is that, Miriam is not allowed to challenge the power of Moses because she's a woman. But Aaron, partly because of maybe the fact that he's male, but also maybe partly because of the fact that he's a priest, has that ability. There's a kind of checks and balance on leadership theme to this parsha as well. It's a troubling bit of the Torah. It just is, and as you said earlier, like really interesting to talk about. This is, I think, sometimes when I've been in text study circles, this comes up again and again, even when it's not on the weekly calendar, because people really want to grapple with this and like, how can we be told to welcome the stranger, but they're critical, and then like, why is there a gender piece to it as well, and is this really just about leadership and how you criticize a leader, like what is really at the core of this punishment, and then does it matter that it's about skin? Like, is this all about skin color and skin in general? I don't know. It's very rich. And it's very easy, I think, to just say, well, Miriam was punished because there's sexism. I think that's true. But I also think that there are layers to this. Like, one thing that rarely gets talked about is the fact that Zipporah, also married to Moses, was a Midianite. So it's not like the first time he's married somebody. Now, he was in a different role then in that story. So that might be part of the layer. But it's interesting that we don't like really make that connection between Zipporah and this unnamed woman, and why their stories are so different.
Yeah. In some ways, this is feeling more and more to me like one of these stories that, like I've said that on Yom Kippur, the traditional reading, or one of the traditional readings, is the chapter in Leviticus that we talked about, where the line, the famous line is the anti-gay sex line, don't lie with a man the lyings of a woman. It's an abomination. And the Reform movement, for example, and I don't remember if you said also the humanistic movement, doesn't read that part of the Torah on Yom Kippur. And I took the position that we should read it. And not only should we read it, we should double down and we should read all of the bad stuff from the Torah on Yom Kippur, because it's the Day of Atonement, and we should atone for this junk that's in our tradition. And we shouldn't just go around all the time saying our tradition is so great. Like, we have some really bad stuff in there. And at least once a year, we should atone for it. And I wonder whether this text should be thrown into that mix, because on the one hand, it is actually good what it says about race at the end, right? Meaning, like, this is a story where where the position that the Torah, that God is taking, is that Moses is taking, is that racism is bad. But where we have to atone in this text really has much more to do with sexism and with some other kind of failure that's not necessarily a ism related, but it's a kind of a failure to treat all parties equally, whether that's all parties that have committed a bad act or all parties that have been victims of a bad act. And there's something really important in there. And I think like what's important to point out is that, and we talked about this weeks ago, like we certainly don't take the position, but I don't think that traditionally necessarily that it's been the position on the Torah that like everything is great in there. And there are different ways in which the rabbis of the Talmud would do it in a more subtle way, where they would kind of say, well, that was a very particular case, and that, and they would kind of legislate it away. I forget if we mentioned this on our show, but I talked about this. I think we did, because I said that like the part of the problem with Reform Judaism is that it threw out the Talmud and therefore focused on the Torah in a way that really Jewish communities hadn't done for 2,000 years or 1,500 years.
Right.
And as a result, some of these things that are in the Torah are particularly troubling and particularly top of mind for people, because that's the only ancient Jewish text that they read. Whereas some of these texts and other bad stuff in the Torah was already taken on by the rabbis, 1,000+ years ago. And we just don't read that stuff, and so we don't even realize that. So it's kind of like if you would read the U.S. Constitution or something, but never knew there were any amendments. That it would be, it's bad with the amendments, but it's much worse without the amendments. So something like that.
Right.
I wanted to talk a little bit about this idea of the second Passover that's in this portion. You want to talk a little bit about what that is?
Sure. So it talks about Pesach Sheni, a second Passover. The idea is that the people were not able to celebrate Passover. And so there should be a second Passover. I don't know if I have much more nuance to add in terms of like what the text actually says. But I like the idea that there's an opportunity for a do-over if the circumstances don't allow for you to mark something on the calendar the way you're supposed to. I remember when, most of us, it was kind of around mid-March when we started to go into physical distancing and staying inside. And it was just before Passover. Again, that feels so long ago, but people were saying, well, we can't really do Passover properly, but let's just do a Pesach Sheni. Let's do it next month, because surely by next month we'll all be free to go wherever we want. And so it was really the first time I heard people take up the idea of a Pesach Sheni in a serious way, like we should actually do it, which was interesting. But in general, I just think it's so nice that in our text, there's this little offering that says, sometimes it won't work out, and you can do it again. You could do it differently.
And one of the things that a lot of people don't know about Hanukkah is that, at least arguably, one of the reasons why Hanukkah is the 8-day holiday that it is because it was actually a Sukkot Sheni, a second Sukkot, because when the regular Sukkot came around, and in the biblical times, the Sukkot was one of the 3 major holidays. So Yom Kippur was not a big deal at all. Actually, it's not even clear that it was a holiday that was celebrated by the people. It seems like it was the cleanup day for the priests getting ready for Sukkot. Rosh Hashanah was a total big nothing. And so the big holidays were Sukkot, Shavuot, and Passover, and that the temple was occupied by the Greeks, the Assyrian Greeks, during Sukkot, and so they couldn't celebrate Sukkot by bringing offerings at the temple. So, and then between Sukkot, after Sukkot, they liberated the temple and were able to bring sacrifices. They said, let's have a Sukkot in December, basically, and we'll make it 8 days. And, that's why Hanukkah is 8 days. The whole issue about
not for the oil.
The whole thing with the oil came much, much, much later in terms of that story. So the Torah talks directly about the idea of the second Passover. The the story of Hanukkah. I mean, the historical story of Hanukkah indicates that this idea that we could do a redo of the holiday at a more convenient time, if we aren't able to do the holiday the traditional way, is in the story of Hanukkah, which is substantially later than the Torah was put into its final form. And I think like this is something that we ought to really be thinking about in terms of the high holidays coming up, because it seems like I'm excited about the idea to do the high holidays in different ways this year. And that's going to be like my main focus. And I think our main focus on Judaism Unbound and Jewish Live is trying to figure out how to have alternatives to the regular high holidays, because frankly, I didn't really like it before COVID. But I was just looking at some like Facebook stuff going on yesterday where certain like more traditional folks in my community were talking about wanting to have little 10 or 12 person gatherings for the high holidays and socially distant, and different people would learn to lead the services. And actually Yehuda Kurtzer from the Hartman Institute did an article about that, or a Facebook post maybe some time ago, where he was sort of talking about a similar thing. And I really feel for those folks, because I know that they will feel that if the high holidays go by and they have not actually prayed in some kind of communal sense, like that's a real loss for them. That's a real source of pain for them. So I want to take that seriously. And yet I don't necessarily think, and in fact, I would say, I don't think at all that the solution has to be to do these small gatherings, which may actually be not feeling that great for them either. So it's surprising to me that nobody has raised the possibility of a Yom Kippur Sheni, a second Yom Kippur, that where maybe it's in a few months, maybe it's in a year, but it feels like it's not out of the tradition to say that if you can't do it the sort of right way, one option is to do it a different way, but one option is to wait until you can do it the right way. And why are people not talking about that? That's what
I mean, well, I don't know why I'm not part of the people who feel like we have to come together at all costs. So I cannot answer that question. I mean, one also possibility is that the next Yom Kippur will come around before we can safely come together in large communities. So it's, I don't know when the Shani can be. Like, can you do a Shani after the next time it comes around? I don't know.
Yeah, well, but there's also the case that like when the temple was occupied and they didn't know when the occupation was going to end, they didn't do Sukkot. I mean, like it turned out that, and I actually think that the Assyrian Greeks were occupying the temple for longer than a year. I think I don't remember, but I think that's very possible that we just will skip it. I mean, that's another possibility. Is like maybe you can skip it.
Yeah, I mean, as a person who's supposed to lead services, I can't really advocate people skip it altogether, but let's just imagine for a moment that I'm not that person. If this is a year that people say, like, I can't do it the way we've talked about this before. My concern is that out of a sense of nostalgia, people will want to replicate as much as possible online what they do normally, and I don't think it will work. And then they will have neither the satisfactory experience of what is traditional for them, nor the goodness that could come from doing it in a new way. And I don't want that. So I do think if this is a year people say, I'm just going to go for a walk in the forest and that's how I'm doing it this year. And I'm not trying to replicate anything or just setting up like a very small thing for me and my one other person, like that might have more power this year. But we do have a do-over option. So if, magically 6 months from now, things are different, then do it then.
Yeah. It's a strange, I don't know, like it's easy to say in a cavalier way, skip it. Right. But, and I understand that that's not, easy for a lot of people. And that's why I'm trying to say, like, I have real compassion for the people who are going to really miss the thing that I'm not going to miss. So it's hard to quite say, can I be helpful or should I just stay out of this one? Because the truth is that it's not actually a source of pain for me. But but the other but the thing that I really want to kind of go back to something that you just said about translating this thing that we generally do in person to an online form, which seems to be almost universally the way that I hear institutions that were sort of existed pre-COVID in person talking about this stuff. It's like, well, we do services on the high holidays. How can we do a digital service on the high holidays? We do camp. How can we do a digital camp? As opposed to, we're an organization that's there to serve people. The way we've been serving people up till now is doing services in person or doing camp or whatever. But this year is a different year. People have different needs. And maybe we could find a way to help them that's profoundly different from what we have been doing. If it's so profoundly different that we actually have no skills in that area, then obviously we shouldn't do that. But maybe they have needs that we actually can address, but we have to get out of the mindset that we are just translating our in-person work into some digital form. And I'm not sure why that is not a more prominent way of thinking about it in the world. I think it's really hard. I get it. I think it's really hard, but I'm not sure that people are thinking about it and saying, we're not going to do that because it's too hard, or they're just not thinking about it. And I wonder what we can do to get them to think about it.
I don't know. I think it's also like a fundamental problem that often people don't know what they actually want, which is complicated to say.
Right.
It sounds like a little bit dictatorial, that like, I know better than you what you need. But I really do think that sometimes people, I've heard a lot of people say they want the familiar stuff, the liturgy, the faces they're used to. And I get that they think they want that, but I worry that they will not want it when it, or like it won't do it for them. You know what I mean? Sometimes what we think we want is not actually what we need. I agree. I would love to see more creativity. And maybe stuff is happening that I don't know about. That's for sure possible. But yeah, I'm a little disappointed that we haven't really energized, what could be unique about doing the high holidays during a pandemic. Like, let's embrace the opportunity of it.
Yeah. It's interesting that people are saying that the that they sort of take it as like a truism that people can't sit on Zoom for 9 hours or whatever, the full Yom Kippur service might be. And so we're going to have to make it shorter. And this seems to be something that people have accepted. And so like, okay, we have to get together to have these like committees to figure out which things we're going to drop and which things we're going to keep and whatever. And I'm like sitting there going like, I can't sit in a 9-hour service in person, and I'm not the only one, right? Meaning why does it take a pandemic and the notion that what they're really saying is, we, the people who can sit for 9 hours in the synagogue in a service, we can't sit through the 9-hour Zoom service. So we have an urgent need to make a shorter service. I think there's something like really deep going on, which I'd like to try to figure out how to articulate maybe in a nicer way, and then, kind of reflect back, is saying there's a much larger number of people than the number of people who have been sitting in the 9-hour service, who don't come to your 9-hour service in the synagogue because we can't sit through that. And
of course,
why has nobody ever cared about us before? And said, let's make a shorter service. Yeah, the service should always be shorter. So, but it feels like, and that's where at the end of the day, I think, and this is here maybe like end with a dare, or with maybe a dare, maybe a j'accuse, but I think that most Jewish organizations are actually not motivated by the desire to help as many Jews as they can. That's not that they're against it, but that's not what makes them make their decisions. What makes their decisions is whether they're financially viable. And I think that a lot of these synagogues that are now in this position, and other kinds of organizations, their real fear is that something is going to happen with COVID that's going to cause them to not be financially viable anymore. And so now they're willing to do all these things that they were never willing to do before, because their core constituency is demanding it. But it's like in economics, there's this idea of the opportunity cost, right? There's the cost of the thing that you have and that you're going to lose, but there's this other cost, which is, in economic terms, the same, of the failure to not get something that you could have gotten. But in human psychology, the opportunity cost is not seen as the identical thing as the loss cost. That's a technical name that I can't remember right now. And I think that that's going on in the Jewish community, and I'm aggrieved about it. in the
Yeah.
sense that I feel like there's a silent majority of Jews who have not been served by Jewish institutions forever. Certainly here in America, for the 150 years that the vast majority of American Jews started coming, and nobody ever really cared that much about them other than to wish that they would come and join us in our thing, until they reach a point where the financial viability of their organizations is under threat. And then they still don't care about them, but they're starting to do the things that those people would have benefited from all these years, because now it's affecting their internal core constituency. Maybe that's the way of the world. Maybe that's inevitable. Maybe that's human nature. But I would like now, at least, that it's happening, to hold up a mirror and say, maybe there's also some room for some kind of apology towards the people who we've neglected for so long. And I don't mean anybody needs to come and apologize. I mean that that hopefully they will start, not just like, especially after COVID is over, that they're not going to just go back to their old ways.
Right. I'm with you.
All right. Well, with that, we dare you, synagogues and everyone out there.
We dare you.
Make your post-COVID plan where you make sure that people who don't want to sit through a 3-hour service on Shabbat or a 9-hour service on the high holidays, that something is available for them as well, and not as a afterthought. And with that, we'll see you next week, Denise.